Welcome to the online course on the Nibbāna sermons 23 to 33 by Bhikkhu Katakurunda Ñāṇananda, a course hosted by the Nibbāna Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hamburg in collaboration with the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies in Massachusetts. And today we'll be looking at Sermon 28. But before that, a few extracts from the discussion on Sermon 27. Mikens commented on the chess game. For me, the chess game was extremely confronting. Seeing through the magic show seemed difficult, but not particularly threatening. The chess game introduces threats that are beyond my control. The game is stacked against me. Seeing through that will be much more challenging. Yeah, I also found the chess game similarly rather dramatic. But then I also thought of an easy solution, more easy than the magic show. If the two simply give up wanting to win, they can have a draw. Nobody will get the prize, but also nobody will get killed. In fact, there's a way of playing chess that you're aiming for a draw. Then Kim Allen on science. I appreciated the almost surgical precision in narrowing in on the internal source of science that we normally attribute to external phenomena. I see this as a simple yet profound instruction for observation that could even occur in daily life practice to some degree. We can observe the mind making significance of external inputs and then turn inward to seek the source or closer to the source of that within. We will surely find lust, hatred, delusion, papancha, fixed views, or some such culprit. Yeah, I thought that was a very, very helpful suggestion. And Venumadhammadina also reflecting on significance, signification, science. How much importance, meaning, and significance do I give to myself? The alleged impact of myself on the world drama. Papancha is actually the epitome of the mind's deluded signification agency. That's a very nice way of putting it. And Robert also on science, in particular on lust, hate, and delusion as makers of science. When walking through the streets the last days and observing the mind, I could very well see how the mind chases after signs and grasps them much quicker and much tighter if the mind is affected by lust, hatred, or delusion. On the other hand, if the mind is balanced and mindful and the focus is broad, then objects are still recognized, but this grasping does not take place anywhere near the same degree of intensity. Yeah, I found that very useful because we always need to keep in mind the distinction between the worldling and the arahant. And as Robert rightly says, the implicitly says the arahant still recognizes objects, uses he or she still uses nimittas. And so for us also, even though we are not yet arahants, there is a range of experience where we are operating with signs, but we are not latching onto them, grasping onto them. And that very almost somatic sense of tightness can be used, or absence of tightness can be used as a signifier of the presence of lust, hate, and delusion. And with that, now into Sermon 28. Itang santang itang panitang yadidang sabba sankara samato sabbu padipati nisaggo tanagayo virago nirodo Nibbānam. This is peaceful, this is excellent, namely the stilling of all preparations, the relinquishment of all assets, the destruction of craving, detachment, cessation, extinction. With the permission of the most venerable great preceptor in the assembly of the venerable meditative monks, this is the 28th sermon in the series of sermons on Nibbāna. Right view, the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, is defined as the knowledge of all the Four Noble Truths, namely that of suffering, its arising, its cessation, and the path leading to its cessation. This is a pointer to the fact that some understanding of cessation or Nibbāna is essential for the practice of the path. According to a discourse among the tools of the Anguttara Nikaya, there are two conditions for the arising of this right view. Dve me bhikkave paccaya sammaditya upadaya. Katame dve paratu ca ghoso yoniso ca manasikaro. Monks, there are these two conditions for the arising of right view. Which two? Hearing from another and radical reflection. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Because there are these two conditions for the arising of right view. What two? The utterance of another person and careful attention. And this is also the reading I wanted to offer for this lecture, an encyclopedia entry on Yoniso Manasikara, radical or careful or penetrative attention. End of comment. Strictly speaking, Yoniso Manasikara or radical reflection is attention by way of source or matrix. The deeper dimensions of its meaning would have come to light in our discussion of Paticca Samuppada, with reference to a quotation from the Mahapadana Sutta in one of our earlier sermons. There we saw how the Bodhisattva Vipassi went on reflecting from the very end of the formula of Paticca Samuppada of dependent arising in reverse order and gradually arrived at the true source. King ino ko sati jara maranang hoti, king paccaya jara maranang. Jati ko sati jara maranang hoti, jati paccaya jara maranang. What being there does decay and death come to be? Conditioned by what is decay and death? Birth being there does decay and death come to be? Conditioned by birth is decay and death. In this way he directed his radical reflection gradually upwards, beginning from decay and death, and at last came to the samsaric vortex between consciousness and name and form, which we discussed at length. This is an illustration of the deepest sense of Yoniso Manasikara as an attitude essential for seeing the law of dependent arising within one's own experience. By now we have already laid bare some first principles for the arising of this radical reflection in the form of similes like the magic show and the chess game. Those similes have illustrated for us the first principle, that a thing originates from, and its thingness depends on, the psychological responses and mental traits of the person concerned. The magic show and the chess game have exposed the fact that the signs and symbols which we conceive to be out there owe their significance and symbolic nature to the deep-rooted psychological mainsprings of lust, hate, and delusion. It was while discussing how the Suchiloma Sutta presents the question of radical reflection that we were forced to stop our last sermon. To the question of Yakka Suchiloma as to the source of lust, hate, delight, and terror, the Buddha replied that they arise hence, from hence itself. In the Pali verses, the Yakka's question Kuto Nidana, Kuto Ja, Kuto Samutaya met with the replies Ito Nidana, Ito Ja, Ito Samutaya from the Buddha's side. This Ito, hence, means from within oneself. This is clear from the term Atta Sambhuta, self-begotten, in the reply given by the Buddha. It is to illustrate this self-begotten nature that the Buddha brings in the similes of the banyan tree and the malava creeper. When the runners coming down from the branches of a banyan tree reach the ground and get rooted, after a time it will be difficult to distinguish the original trunk of the tree from its offsprings. So also is the case with the parasitic Malava creeper. When the seed of a Malava creeper takes root in the fork of a tree and grows up, it not only kills the tree, but also overspreads it in such a way as to obscure its origin. From these similes, we can infer that the self-begotten nature of those psychological states are also generally overlooked or ignored. They are revealed only to radical reflection, to attention by way of source or matrix. That is why the Buddha emphasizes the need for discerning the true source. That is an injunction directly relevant to the practice, is clearly expressed in the last verse in the Suci Loma Sutta. Yenang pajananti yato nidanang te nang vinodenti sunuyakka. Teruttarang oghang imang taranti atinna pubbang an punabbhavaya. And they that know wherefrom it springs, they dispel it, listen, O Yakka. They cross this flood so hard to cross, never crossed before, to become no more. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Those who understand their source, they dispel it, listen, O Yakka. They cross this flood so hard to cross, uncrossed before, for no renewed existence. End of comment. The commentary takes the term Yatonidana in this verse as a reference to the second noble truth of craving. The term Atta Sambhuta is explained as arisen within oneself, Attani Sambhuta, but not much attention is given to it. However, if we are to elicit the deeper meaning of these lines, we have to take up for comment this term occurring in the preceding verse. We came across this term earlier too in our discussion of a verse in the Kosala Samyutta. Lobo doso cha mohocha purisang papachetasang hingsanti atasambhuta tachasarangva sampalang. Greed, hate, and delusion too, sprung from within, work harm on him. Of evil wit as does its fruit on the reed for which the bark is pith. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Greed, hatred, and delusion arisen from within oneself injure the person of evil mind as its own fruit destroys the reed. End of comment. In this context too, the term Atta Sambhota is mentioned. When we reflect deeply on the significance of this term, we are first of all reminded of the vortex simile we employed to explain the reciprocal relationship between consciousness and name and form in our discussion of the law of dependent arising, as stated in the Mahanidana Sutta at the very outset of this series of sermons. Atta Sambhota, literally rendered, would mean originating from oneself. But this so-called oneself, conceived as a unit or a center of activity, is actually based on a duality. The notion of a self is to be traced to an interrelation between two conditions. That is the reciprocal relationship between consciousness and name and form, which we discussed earlier too. Vijnana paccaya nama rupang, nama rupa paccaya vijnanam. Dependent on consciousness is name and form. Dependent on name and form is consciousness. As the Bodhisattva Vipassi understood through radical reflection, consciousness turns back from name and form. It does not go beyond. Pachudavatati koidang vijnanang na parupamha na parangacchati. Here is a vortex, a turning round. The delusion or ignorance is the non-understanding of the reciprocal relationship between these two. The understanding of it is the insight into the true source of all defilements. To hark back to our simile of the chess game, this non-understanding is like the split into two sides. The two friends quite amicably prepared the chessboard and the pieces. But for them to play the game, there should be two sides. It is after this bifurcation and confrontation as two sides that the actual game starts, with its vicissitudes of winning and losing. Preparations grow, yielding the consequences of wish fulfillments and disappointments to the competitors. This is the norm underlying this bifurcation. So ignorance is the non-understanding of the fact that the basis of this atta sambhava, or springing up from within, namely the dichotomy, is in fact a mutual interrelation between two conditions. In other words, the ignorance which gives rise to those preparations that go to create the vortex between consciousness and name and form is the non-understanding of the mutual interrelation implicit in this vertical interplay. That is why one is instructed in insight meditation to reflect on preparations relating to name and form. An insight into those preparations reveals this mutual interrelation. There is such a dichotomy implicit in the term atta sambhava. The commentary explains the correlative yato nidanam, whence arising, as a reference to tanha or craving. But it is actually an allusion to ignorance. The true source is non-understanding. That is why the Buddha, in presenting the formula of paticca samuppada, went beyond craving and placed ignorance at the head of the series of 12 links. Very often, the commentators mention this as a possible point of controversy. But the real reason for its precedence is the fact that ignorance is more primary than craving as a condition. It is more basic than craving. When one probes into the conditions for craving, one discovers ignorance as its root. That is why, in stating the law of paticca samuppada in the reverse order, the Buddha used the expression avidyaya tveva asesa viraga nirodha, etc., with the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance, etc. It is with the cessation of ignorance that the entire series of conditions move in the opposite direction. So ignorance is primary as a condition. We can explain this primacy in another way. Now, upadana is that grasping of the object of craving. Actually, it signifies a holding on to something. What gives the impression that the object of craving is something that can be grasped is a lack of deep understanding of the principle of duality. Craving finds something to hold on to precisely because one presumes that there actually exists a thing to be grasped. That is how it gets object status. This way we can explain the basic reason for the recurrent birth in samsara as the non-understanding of the mutual interrelation between conditions. This sustains the notion of a duality. There's a verse in the Nibbāna Sutta which throws more light on the meaning of the term atta sambhava. The verse, which is found also in the section on the eighths in the Anguttara Nikaya, as well as in the Udana, runs as follows. Tulanga tulancha sambhavam bhavasankarang avassaji muni ajhattarato samahito abhinni kavachang idatta sambhavam. That preparation for becoming, the sage gave up, whence arise an equal and an unequal. Inwardly wrapped and concentrated, he split like an armor the origin of self. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Comparing the incomparable and continued existence, the sage let go the force of existence. Rejoicing internally, concentrated, he broke his own existence like a coat of armor. End of comment. At the spot called Chapala Chaitya, the Buddha renounced the preparations pertaining to the lifespan and declared that he will attain Parinibbāna 3 months hence. There was an earth tremor immediately afterwards, and the Buddha uttered this paean of joy to explain its significance. However, this verse has puzzled many scholars, both Eastern and Western. The commentators themselves are in a quandary. They advance alternative interpretations, particularly in connection with the riddle-like term tulang, as evidenced by the commentaries to the Digha Nikaya and Anguttara Nikaya. According to the first interpretation given, Tulang stands for whatever pertains to the sense sphere, and Atulang refers to the five material and immaterial spheres. The second interpretation, prefixed by an or else, Atava, takes Tulang to mean both the sense spheres and the five material sphere, and Atulang to refer only to the immaterial sphere. In a third interpretation, Tulang is taken to mean of little karmic result, and Atulang to mean of great karmic result. A fourth interpretation tries to tackle the difficult term in a different way altogether. Tulang ti tulento tirento atulang cha sambhavanti nibbāna cheva sambhavancha. Tulang means comparing, determining. Atulang cha sambhavang means nibbāna and becoming. Here the word tulang is presumed to be a present participle. To add to the confusion, Netipakarana advances yet another interpretation. Tulanti sankhara dhatu, atulanti nibbāna dhatu. Tulang means sankhara element, atulang means nibbāna element. It seems, however, that we have to approach the whole problem from a different angle altogether. The twin term tulang-atulang most properly represents the principle of duality we have discussed at length in this series of sermons. Tulang and atulang in a pairwise combination convey the idea of equality and inequality as antonyms. The phrase tulang-atulang cha sambhavang is suggestive of that dichotomy which forms the basis of the self-idea. Atthasambhava, or the origin of the self-notion, is traceable to this dichotomy, which is like the two friends confronting each other in a game of chess. The two sides of the game may be taken as two halves of the same thing, standing opposite to each other. This is the tragicomedy of the situation. It is on these two halves of this dichotomy that the origin of the notion of self is based. A clear enunciation of this truth is found in the Sutta Nibbāna. For instance, the following verse of the Māgandhīya Sutta brings out the principle of dichotomy rather rhetorically. Sachanti so brahmano king vadeya musati vaso vivadeta kena yasing samang visamanchapi nanti sakena vadang patisang yujaya. What could that Brahmin speak of as truth? How could he debate, calling something false? By what criterion could he, in whom there is no distinction between equal and unequal, join issue in a debate? We come across a similar verse in the Attadanda Sutta of the Sutta Nibbāna. A comment, translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Why would that Brahmin assert it's true? Or with whom would he dispute it's false? When for him there is no equal and unequal, with whom would he engage in debate? End of comment. Na samesu, na omesu, na usesu vadati muni, santo so vitamajjaro nadeti nanyarasati. The sage does not grade himself among equals, inferior or superiors. Being at peace, and with selfishness gone, he neither takes up nor throws away. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. The Muni does not speak of himself as among equals, inferiors, or superiors. Peaceful, without miserliness, he does not take, does not reject. End of comment. Here again the issue is the triple conceit. It is by dispelling conceit that the sage entertains no inclinations to grade himself among equals, inferiors, or superiors. Peaceful and unselfish as he is, he neither acquires nor rejects. Here we see a reference to that dichotomy. The same idea comes up in another guise in the following verse of the Tuvattaka Sutta of the Sutta Nibbāna, which can be an incentive to the recollection of peace, upassamano sati. Ajjatang eva upasame na anyato bhikkho santing eseya. Ajjatang upasantasa natyatang kutonirattam. Let the monk inwardly calm himself. Let him not seek peace from outside. To one who is inwardly calm, there is nothing taken up or rejected. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. It is internally that he should achieve peace. A bhikkhu should not seek peace through another. For one who is at peace within himself, there is nothing taken up, much less rejected. End of comment. We came across the two terms attang nirattang earlier too in our discussion of a verse in the Duttattaka Sutta. There, the line attang nirattang haitasa attanti meant the absence of the idea of taking up and rejecting in an arahant. Very often scholars interpret the term attang in this context as self, which in our opinion is incorrect. The phrase nadeti na nirassati gives a clear hint as to the etymology of this term. It is derived from da, prefixed by a, giving adattam, which by syncopation becomes atan, which again by shortening of the vowel comes as atta. Niratta is derived from nirassati. These two terms, suggestive of a duality, remind us of the water pump we mentioned in our discussion of the vortex. There is nothing really automatic even in a water pump, which takes in and throws out. Due to these two aspects in the mechanism of a water pump, we call it a unit. From the point of view of a water pump, it is capable of performing both functions. It is from this point of view that we attribute a unitary significance to it. In this very concept of a unit, one can discern the delusion involved. Delusion is the apex of the vicious triangle greed, hate, and delusion. Greed and hate are the two feelers, directed from the apex delusion. Though we regard them as two functions, the taking in and throwing out are simply two aspects of the same function. All this points to the depth of the idea of duality and to the vortex simile, which our commentary tradition seems to have ignored. It is the same theme of duality that comes up in the first two lines of that cryptic verse of the Brahmana Vagga in the Dhammapada we had occasion to quote earlier. Yasa parang aparang vam, para parang na vinjati. To that Brahmin, that is the Arahant, there is neither a farther shore, nor a hither shore, nor both. There is something extraordinary about this statement. Against this background, we can now advance a plausible interpretation to the puzzling verse we had quoted earlier in this discussion. The first two lines, tulang atulancha sambhavam, bhavasankarang avasaji muni, could be understood as follows. The sage renounced the preparations for becoming, which give rise to a distinction between equal and unequal. That is to say, the supreme sage gave up those preparations productive of the dichotomy between the concepts of equal and unequal. Now the next two lines, ajhattarato samaito abhinni kavachang idatta sambhavang, could be explained as follows. Inwardly content and concentrated, he broke up the point of origin of self like an armor. This breaking up of the armor happened not at the moment he uttered this verse, but at the moment he attained perfect enlightenment. Then what is the provocation for making such a declaration at this juncture? The Buddha renounced the preparations pertaining to the lifespan, Ayu Sankara, after several requests to that effect by Mara. It may seem that the Buddha bowed down to Mara's request, and that he came under Mara's sway when he declared that the Tathagata's Parinibbāna will take place 3 months hence. But the true implication of the verse in question is that the armor of Mara, the armor of self-originatta sambhava, has been broken down already, and as such he is not within the clutches of Mara. Comment. Yeah, I will come back to the Atta Sambhava a little later below, where I will be presenting an interpretation by Bhikkhu Bodhi that to my understanding makes more sense. But I just wanted to comment now on this whole episode with Mara. This is another of these passages in the Mahaparinibbāna Sutta where I have no real basis in the parallels, in the critical comparative study of the parallels, but I just offer my personal opinion. I find this whole passage very strange. In particular, the idea that Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant and was so devoted to his teacher, would have failed to intervene or do the needful in order for the Buddha to decide to extend his life. And then the Buddha, going along with Mara's suggestion, this whole episode seems to me to be very difficult to take serious. And my interpretation, and this is just really a subjective speculation, as I have not yet done my own comparative study of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, but from what I know from others, it's a very good comparative study by Waldschmidt. This episode seems to be found similarly in the parallels, so we have no real sound basis apart from the fact that the Mahaparinibbana Sutta is a Vinaya text and therefore partakes of that whole tendency of Vinaya text to later elaboration. But it seems to me probable that tradition had a problem with the fact that the Buddha quite unexpected suddenly passed away in the middle of one of his wanderings. One problem was the place. He could have passed away in some big place. Instead, he passed away in this small village. And then there's this whole story of the Mahasudassana story of purportedly explaining what an important place this was in the past, and so that the Buddha kind of intentionally passed away in this place. And the other one that he just succumbed to death almost accidentally, and that the later tradition needed to make sense out of that, and then like preceded by him intentionally saying, I'm going to die. And this need to explain timing and place of his passing away as both a matter of intention then lead to this whole bizarre story of Mara and Ananda getting a very bad role in this whole episode, which is again part of another trend that we can more clearly see in the account of the first Sangiti, the first communal recitation, sometimes a little bit mistakenly translated as council, after the Buddha's passing away. There's a very clear overall trend for tradition after the Buddha's death to steer back into a more traditional ancient Indian ascetic ideology. And this trend is then being played out in this Sangiti account by contrasting Mahakassapa and Ananda. And I'm not speaking here about Mahakassapa and Ananda as historical persons, but much rather as literary figures to represent an underlying tension in the early Buddhist community. And we get this whole episode of Ananda being reprimanded for various shortcomings, in fact, even sometimes not being allowed to participate in the first Sangiti and only being allowed in at the last moment. And what I see behind that is an attempt to justify why Ananda, who was the closest person to the Buddha, still alive when the Buddha passed away after Sariputta and Mahamoggallana had already died, why he was kind of relegated to a back seat, we can say, and to justify this move back into a more ascetic and to some degree also even misogynist tendency, particularly against nuns and women. And so I think these two strands kind of combine in this story. One strand of trying to sort of diminish the importance of Ananda and associate him with some negative images, just like here he is so careless that it's basically his fault that the Buddha then decides to pass away. And the other one simply that problem of later tradition of not realizing that the Buddha's transcendence of death and his realization of the deathless is not something that has to play out on the physical level, but it's something entirely mental. It's something that manifests, for example, in his ability to pass away and proceed through all of the jhanas and immaterial spheres up and down at his will. He's not in any way perturbed by the onset of death. But this does not mean that he has to intentionally choose place and time and make sure he passes away in some big city, or he has to take a decision at an earlier point. No, I'm going to let my Ayu Sankara, my life formations, let go of them. So yeah, well, anyway, enough. And again, once again, I have no basis in any comparative findings for taking such a position. So take it with a grain of salt and just as some personal speculations by Anālayo, nothing more. End of comment. Some scholars seem to identify this giving up of preparations for becoming bhava with the renouncing of preparations pertaining to the lifespan, ayu sankara. But there's a distinction between these two. The former, that is, bhava are preparations productive of existence, which go to build up a bhava. These the Buddha had already done away with by breaching the samsaric vortex between vijnana and nama-rupa. Chinnang vattang navattati, the whirlpool cut off, worlds no more. Those eddies are no longer active in that consciousness. Preparations pertaining to the lifespan Ayu Sankara have to be explained differently. The term Ayu Sankara, mentioned in the Nibbāna Sutta, refers to the ability the Buddha possessed by virtue of developing the four bases of success, Nibbāna, of lengthening his lifespan. Because Venerable Ananda did not invite him at the correct moment to make use of that ability, he renounced it at Chāpala Chetya. That renouncing is compared in that sutta itself to a vomiting. The Buddha tells Ananda that it is not in the nature of a Tathagata to take in what he has already vomited, even for the sake of life. So then Ayu Sankara and Bhava Sankara have to be distinguished between. Preparations pertaining to the lifespan are not the same as preparations productive of existence or becoming. Comment, yeah, I do not find this interpretation convincing. I think here Ayu Sankara, Bhava Sankara, and Jivita Sankara are probably referring to the same thing. And I would also take that from the context. The context is the letting go of these Ayu Sankara, and so I think the inspired utterance made on that occasion should also be related to that topic. And here I have a comment by Bhikkhu Bodhi that gives an interpretation that I find more convincing. In my understanding, Sambhavang here does not mean continued existence in samsara, the course of which the Buddha had already ended with his attainment of enlightenment 45 years earlier. Here the word means rather the continuation of his present life until the end of the kappa. Having compared the prospect of continuing on until the end of the eon with the prospect of attaining final Nibbāna, the incomparable Atulan, the Buddha opted for the latter. Thus, by rejecting the Bhava Sankara that might have sustained him until the end of the eon, the Buddha renounced the extension of his life. Yeah, I find this more convincing interpretation. End of comment. Understood in this way, it becomes clear that all the attachments, aversions, and delusions in the world stem from non-understanding of the fact that the duality we have discussed so far is actually an interrelation. It is as if the two friends who amicably prepared the chessboard forgot their friendship when they confronted each other as two sides. This duality is a very subtle problem. The Buddha has pointed out how to resolve it through understanding by means of various meditation techniques. Perhaps the best illustration is the meditative attention by way of elements as stated in the suttas. We have already mentioned about this to some extent in a previous sermon while discussing the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta. If we are to analyze this technique of meditative attention by way of elements from a practical point of view, we may cite the relevant section from the Maha Hatipadopama Sutta preached by Venerable Sariputta. Addressing his fellow monks, Venerable Sariputta says, Katamacha bhusa patavidhatu siya ajhatika siya bahira. Katamacha bhusa ajhatika patavidhatu, yang ajhattang pachattang kakkalang karigatang upadinnang seyatidang kesa luma naka danta tacho mangsang naharu ati minja vakang harayang yakanang kilomakang piakang pappasang antang antagunang dariyang karisang. Yang wapan nanyang pi kinchi ajhattang pachattang kakkalang karigatang upadinnang ayang buchitavosu ajhatika patavidhatum. Yacheva kupana jatika patavidato, yacha bahira patavidato revisa. Tang netang mama, nesu hamasmi, namesu atati, evametang yatha bhotang sammappanyaya dattavvam. Evametang yatha bhotang sammappanyaya disva patavidhatoya nibbindati, patavidhatoya chittang virajati. What friends is the earth element? The earth element may be either internal or external. What friends is the internal earth element? Whatever is internal, belonging to oneself, hard, solid and clung to, that is head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidney, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, large intestines, small intestines, contents of the stomach, faces, or whatever else is internal, belonging to oneself, hard, solid and clung to, this is called, friends, the internal earth element. Now, whatever is the internal earth element and whatever is the external earth element, both are simply the earth element. And that should be seen as it actually is with right wisdom thus. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Having seen it as it actually is with right wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the earth element, becomes dispassionate towards the earth element. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇamoli. What, friends, is the earth element? The earth element may be either internal or external. What is the internal earth element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified and clung to. That is head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, intestines, mesentery, contents of the stomach, feces, or whatever else internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified and clung to. This is called the internal earth element. Now, both the internal earth element and the external earth element are simply earth element. And that should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom thus. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the earth element and makes the mind dispassionate toward the earth element. And the Chinese parallel. What, venerable friends, is the earth element? There are two kinds of earth element. There is the internal earth element and the external earth element. What, venerable friends, is the internal earth element? Whatever internally, being inside the body, is solid, solidified, whatever is internally clung to. And what is that? It is hair of the head, hair of the bodies, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, heart, kidneys, liver, lungs, spleens, intestines, stomach, feces, so whatever else that exists in this body is found inside it that is solid, solidified, and is internally clung to. Venerable friends, this is called the internal earth element. Yet the unlearned, deluded worldling thinks this is me, this is mine, or I belong to this. On the other hand, a noble disciple who has learned much does not think, "This is me, this is mine, or I belong to this." How could he have such a thought? End of comment. Venerable Sariputta has not given here instances of the external earth element, because it is obvious enough, that is, whatever is external to the body. A statement that is of paramount importance here is the following. Yāceva kopāna ajhattika patavidhātu yacha bāhira patavidhātu revesa. Now, whatever is the internal element and whatever is the external earth element, both are simply the earth element. When regarded as earth element, both are the same. And this is the premise from which insight takes off. That should be seen as it actually is with right wisdom thus: this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. With this insight into the earth element, with right wisdom, one gets disenchanted with it and becomes dispassionate. As we pointed out earlier too, the term viraga, usually rendered by detachment or dispassion, has a nuance suggestive of a fading away. Here the term virajati clearly brings out that nuance. Thus patavi dhatuya chittang virajate seems to imply something like he makes the earth element fade away from his mind. We have already quoted such instances as pityacha viraga, with the fading away of joy, and avidya viraga, with the fading away of ignorance, to highlight this nuance of the term viraga. In this context too, it seems the function of disenchantment, nibbida, is to see that whatever color the earth element has infused in the mind is made to fade away. It is a detachment as well as a decoloration. What then is the true purpose of resolving the distinction between internal and external with regard to the earth element? The purpose is the breaking up of the foundation for cravings, conceits, and views. For me to inquire some object out of craving, that object has to exist apart from me, and I have to stand apart from it. The statement "this is mine" presupposes a duality between me and mine. Similarly, the statement "this am I," expressive of conceit, smacks of duality. For instance, one gazing at a mirror is imperceptibly involved in this duality when he tries to compare his face with its reflection in the mirror. This is the irony of the situation in ordinary life. But what we have here in this sutta is the opposite viewpoint. Not "this is mine," not "this am I," not "this is myself." What fosters this opposite point of view is the very absence of the distinction between the internal and the external. The fundamental basis for acquisition or measuring is gone. It is as if the unending game of chess with all its vicissitudes has ended in a peaceful draw. As a matter of fact, our entire samsaric existence is a chess game between the organic upadinna and the inorganic anupadinna. For instance, the four elements within this body, the grasped par excellence, or the clung to, and the four elements as nutrition and atmosphere, are always in conflict in their game of chess. This chess game has as its vicissitudes the disturbances of the three humours, wind, bile, and phlegm, on the physical side, and greed, hate, and illusion on the mental side. These disturbances are to a great extent the outcome of this false dichotomy. The task before a meditator, therefore, is the resolving of this conflict by a penetrative understanding of the mutual interrelation between the two sides, internal and external. When the gap between the two is removed, the mind becomes equanimous. We are told that the contemplation of the four elements is an effective means of developing equanimity. Among the parts of our body there are some we pride on and cherish, some others, like excreta and urine, we abhor and detest. When regarded as mere elements, attachment and revulsion give place to equanimity. The description of the contemplation on elements, as found in the Satipatthana Sutta, clearly illustrates this fact. The relevant section runs as follows. Punacha parang bhikkhave bhikkhu imameva kāyang yathātitang yathāpanitang dhātu sapancha venkati Atanti imasmin kāye patavi dhātu apo dhātu techo dhātu vayo dhātuti Sayathapi bhikkhave dakho ghatako va ghatakante vasiva Gāving baditva chātu mahapate bilaso pativibhajitva nissinno asa Evamevo ko bhikkhave bhikkhu imameva kāyang yathātitang yathāpanitang dhātu sapancha venkati Atanti imasmin kāya patavi dhātu apo dhātu techo dhātu vaya dhātuti Again, monks, the monk reflects on the same body as it stands and as it is disposed, as consisting of elements thus. In this body there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. Just as a skilled butcher or his apprentice, having killed a cow, were seated at the crossroads with it cut up into small pieces, so too a monk reflects on this same body as it stands and as it is disposed, as consisting of elements thus. In this body there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇamoni. Again, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu reviews this same body, however it is placed, however disposed, by way of elements thus. In this body there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. Just as though a skilled butcher or his apprentice had killed a cow and was seated at the crossroads with it cut up into pieces. So too a bhikkhu reviews this same body by way of elements thus. In this body there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. And here the two Chinese parallels, and before reading them I wanted to note that the Madhyama Agama expands from 4 to 6 elements, and this is clearly a later development. Confusion between the listing of 4 elements as descriptive of material world with the listing of 6 elements as descriptive of the whole of experience by including space and consciousness, but consciousness obviously has no place under contemplation of anatomical parts. So first the Madhyama Agama. It is just as a butcher who, on having slaughtered and skinned a cow, divides it into 6 parts and spreads them on the ground for sale. In the same way a monk contemplates the body's elements. Within this body of mine there are the earth element, the water element, the fire element, the wind element, the space element, and the consciousness element. And the Kotarika Agama. It is just like a capable cow butcher or the apprentice of a cow butcher who divides a cow into pieces by cutting through its tendons. While dividing it, he contemplates and sees for himself that these are the feet, this is the heart, these are the tendons, and this is the head. In this way, a monk distinguishes the elements, contemplating and examining himself, that in this body they are the earth, water, fire, and wind elements. End of comment. It is noteworthy that the monk is instructed to reflect on this same body as it stands and as it is disposed. Imameva kāyanga yathātitang yathāpanitang. These words are particularly significant in that they do not apply an atomistic or microscopic analysis. The 4 elements are already there in the body, and though it is mentioned in brief here, in other discourses the organic instances for each of them are described at length. Comment, yeah, I like to underline the importance of the distinction made by the Venerable here, and that it is indeed not about an atomistic or microscopic analysis. This is very clearly a later development. End of comment. The simile used in connection with this analysis is highly significant. When a butcher or his apprentice kills a cow, cuts it into small pieces, and sits at the crossroads ready to sell the meat, he is no longer particular about the cow from which it came. He is conscious of it merely as a heap of meat. Similarly, the contemplation by way of elements inculcates an equanimous attitude. Just as the distinction between the upadina and the anupadina is suggestive of the duality between the organic and the inorganic, The distinction between Ajatta and Bahiddha has relevance to the duality between one's own and another's. This aspect of the reflection on elements emerges in the summary-like section that follows. Iti ajattam va kaye kayanupasi viharati bahiddha va kaye kayanupasi viharati ajatta bahiddha va kaye kayanupasi viharati. In this way he abides contemplating the body as a body internally, or he abides contemplating the body as a body externally, or he abides contemplating the body as a body both internally and externally. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. In this way he abides contemplating the body as a body internally, externally, and both internally and externally. And the two Chinese parallels, Madhyama Agama. In this way a monk contemplates the body as a body internally and contemplates the body as a body externally. And Ekottarika Agama. Here, in regard to his own body, a monk contemplates the body internally, contemplates the body externally, and contemplates the body internally and externally. End of comment. Here too, the aim is to break down the dichotomy between one's own and another's. This contemplation is of a purpose to the extent that by it one realizes the fact that, whether internal or external, it is just the four elements. This norm is succinctly expressed as yathaidam tatha etam, yathaidam tatha idam. Just as this, so is that. Just as that, so is this. Our minds are obsessed by the perception of diversity, nanatta sanya. According to color and form, we distinguish objects in the outside world and give them names. It is a burden or a strain to the mind. The reflection by way of elements, as given in the Satipatthana Sutta, could even be appreciated as a step towards the perception of unity, ekatta sanya. From this grosser perception of diversity, it tends to relaxation and unification of the mind. So the purpose of this reflection by way of the elements, peculiar to the discourses, is to look upon the elements as void, in accordance with the Buddha's advice, dhātuyo suññata passa, look upon the elements as void. Comment, I find this contemplation of the elements a particularly useful way of approaching emptiness, which can sometimes be misunderstood due to the way the idea of emptiness developed in later tradition, and also tendency sometimes to confuse not self with nothingness, as if emptiness means there's nothing at all. And so just this daily life contemplation or reflection, that yathaidang tataidang, the material elements outside, the material elements in this body are just the same, is a very soft but at the same time penetrative and helpful approach to build up gradually one's insight into emptiness. End of comment. However, for some reason or other, perhaps due to the influence of some Indian schools of philosophy with a slant towards materialism, some Buddhist sects indulged in academic subtleties which seem to obsess the mind with the four elements, with concepts about them, instead of the simpler reflection on elements characteristic of the suttas. Originally, the purpose was to erase the four elements from the mind. The original purpose was to make the four elements the amorphous primaries, which masquerades as form in the minds of beings for incalculable aeons, to fade away from the mind. But what happened later was to revel in atomistic analysis, which more or less followed the way of thinking peculiar to materialism. Excuse me. It ended up in hair-splitting analysis, even literally, painting, for instance, the earth element all the more vividly in the mind. We have to assess this academic trend against the original purpose. unbiased by their traditional predilection for it. It is no exaggeration to say that all this tended to obscure the path to Nibbāna in the course of time. The Buddha's research was something entirely different. His research into the four elements took a completely different course. In the Nidāna Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha proclaims the results of this research into the four elements. Patavi dhātu ayang bhikkhave asāda pariyesanang acchāri. Yo patavi dhātuya asādo tad ajaggamang. Yavata patavi dhātuya asādo panyayame so suditto. Patavi dhātuya ayang bhikkhave ādīnava pariyesanang accharing. Yo patavi dhātuya ādīnava tad ajaggamang. Yavata patavidātuya ādīnava paññāyame sosudindho. Patavidātuya hang bhikkhave nissana pariyesanang accharing. Yang patavidātuya nissana nang tad ajaggamang. Yavata patavidātuya nissarang paññāyame tang sudittam. Monks went in search of the gratification in the earth element. Whatever gratification there is in the earth element, that have I found out. Whatever is the range of the gratification of the earth element, that have I well discerned with wisdom. Monks went in search of the danger in the earth element. Whatever danger there is in the earth element, that have I found out. Whatever is the range of the danger of the earth element, that have I well discerned with wisdom. Monks went in search of the stepping out from the earth element. Whatever stepping out there is from the earth element, that have I found out. Whatever is the range of the stepping out from the earth element, that have I well discerned with wisdom. Common translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. I set out seeking the gratification in the earth element. Whatever gratification there is in the earth element, that I discovered. I have clearly seen with wisdom just how far the gratification in the earth element extends. Because I set out seeking the danger in the earth element. Whatever danger there is in the earth element, that I discovered. I have clearly seen with wisdom just how far the danger in the earth element extends. Because I set out seeking the escape from the earth element. Whatever escape there is from the earth element, that I discovered. I have clearly seen with wisdom just how far the escape from the earth element extends. End of comment. Now this is the Buddha's research into the earth element. The discourse goes on to state that the same fact holds with regard to the other three elements. The term asada mentioned in the sutta is defined as the bodily pleasure and mental happiness, sukhang somanasam, arising due to the earth element. The danger in the earth element is its impermanent, suffering and changing nature, anicca dukkha viparinama dhamma. The stepping out from it is the disciplining and abandonment of desire for it. Chanda raga vinayo, chanda raga pahanam. It is on the strength of this research that the Buddha even enjoined the reflection on the four requisites. The Aryavamsa Sutta makes this sufficiently clear. In connection with the modes of reflection on the use of the four requisites, a thematic phrase occurs which is highly significant in this concern. Laddacha pindapadang agatito amochito anacchupanno adinavadasavi nissarla panyo paribhunjati. On getting alms food, he partakes of it without greed, uninfatuated, unenslaved, being aware of the danger in it, with the wisdom in stepping out. Common translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. If he does not get alms food, he is not agitated. And if he gets some, he uses it without being tied to it, infatuated with it, and blindly absorbed in it, seeing the danger in it and understanding the escape from it. End of comment. The terms agatito, amuchito, anajjapanno, without greed, uninfatuated, unenslaved, are suggestive of the gratification which one has to withstand. The term adinavadasavi, being aware of the danger, is suggestive of overeating and other possible risks in taking food. The meaning of the expression nissarapanyo, with the wisdom in stepping out, in the highest sense is taking food with a deep idea of abandoning food, in accordance with the cryptic dictum Aharang nisaya aharang pajahati. Gives up food depending on food. It should be clear from the foregoing what the original idea behind the contemplation on the elements was and what happened later. The later trends seem to have ignored the fact that perception is a mirage. Research into these four elements is a matter for the physicists, though it is like chasing a mirage with thoughts and concepts. What is needed is the liberation of the mind from the perception of form that is ingrained in the minds of beings due to the four elements in this long samsara. All the meditation techniques the Buddha has taught are directed towards the fading away of this perception of form. Because of these four primaries, we have a perception of form which enables us to take signs. All the four are actually impermanent, but the perceptual data we have gathered dependent on them are indelibly imprinted on our minds. Signs taken up in the far distant past in one samsara can come up again and again as attachments and aversions to perpetuate one's samsaric existence. The thoughts and prolific concepts arise out of this perception of form. In other words, we distinguish between one thing and another according to color and shape. By evaluating them through attachments and aversions, we allow them to get deeply rooted in our mind. These are the latencies to perception which in the Madhupindika Sutta find mention in the expression Sanya Nanusenti. Perceptions do not lie latent. Whereas the Arahant does away with these latencies, the non-Arahant entertains them to some extent or other. These latencies account for the prolific concepts with which beings heap up samsaric suffering. In order to loosen the hold of these signs on our minds, the perilous aspect of the four elements has to be emphasized. That is why the Buddha, in a number of discourses, described to the monks the impermanence of the four elements. It was not his intention to encourage an atomistic analysis. He preached about the impermanence of the four elements to expose the hollowness and vanity of this drama of existence, to erase the perception of form, productive of this drama, from the minds of beings. Now, sankhara is a term we often come across in this Dhamma. We happen to suggest a possible nuance of the term when we brought up similes relating to the cinema and the theatre. Sankhara is a term capable of comprehending the entire range of preparations that go to make up a theatrical performance. Now, the Buddha has related the story of this great earth in some discourses. But it is not an account of a scientific experiment, as our modern day scientists would offer. The Buddha describes how this great earth came up and how it gets destroyed in order to drive home into our minds the impermanence of the very stage on which we enact our samsaric drama, thereby inculcating an attitude of disenchantment and dispassion, nibbida and viraga. These sankharas pertaining to our drama of existence on this gigantic stage, the earth, get deeply imprinted in our minds. They sink deep as latencies to perception, productive of existence. It is to eradicate them that the Buddha has placed before us the story of this great earth in some discourses. By far the best illustration comes in the Agganya Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. According to it, at the beginning of this eon, the earth was immersed in a darkness and covered with water. The inhabitants were those who had come down from the Abhasara Brahma world. They were sexless, mind-made, feeding on joy, self-luminous, and capable of moving through the air. Manumaya piti bhagga sayang pabha antalikachara. After billions and billions of years, the savory earth spread itself over the waters, like the tissue that foams over hot milk as it cools. It was very sweet and tempting. Some being of a greedy nature, exclaiming, "Ah, what can this be?" tasted the savory earth with his finger. Craving arose in him as a result of it. Others who saw him doing it did the same. Then they all began digging into the savory earth with their hands and eating it, with the result that their subtle bodies became gross, hard, and solid. Craving also increased, and their minds became rougher and coarser. The environment changed in unison, becoming grosser and grosser. So we have here the perilous aspect. As the perils become manifest, the watery earth grew in solidity, and the simple life grew in complexity. Billions and billions of years passed until the earth assumed its present shape and appearance, with all its gigantic mountains, rocks, and buildings. But then, in the Satta Surya Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha describes what happens to this great earth at the end of the eon. As the Holocaust draws near, a second orb of the sun appears, and then a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and a seventh. The great earth in its entirety, together with its mountains and rocks, goes ablaze, becoming just one huge flame of fire, consuming all before it without leaving any ash or soot, like in a spot where oil or ghee had burnt. So here we have no room for any atomism. In conclusion, the Buddha brings out the true aim or purpose of this discourse. Evaṁ anicca bhikkhave sankhara, evaṁ addhuva bhikkhave sankhara, evaṁ anasasika bhikkhave sankhara. Yavan chirang bhikkhave alang eva sabbha sankharesu nibbinditum, alang vyarajitum, alang vimuchitum. So impermanent monks are preparation. So unstable monks are preparations. So unsatisfying monks are preparations. So much so, monks, this is enough to get disenchanted with preparation. This is enough to get dispassionate with them. This is enough to get released from them. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. So impermanent are conditioned phenomena, so unstable, so unreliable. It is enough to become disenchanted with all conditioned phenomena, enough to become dispassionate towards them, enough to be liberated from them. And the Madhyama Agama parallel. All formations are impermanent, of a nature not to last, quickly changing by nature, unreliable by nature. Thus one should not delight in or attach to formations, one should loathe them as troublesome, one should seek to abandon them, one should seek to be free from them. Thank you very much for your attention.